Thank you for joining us. We're going to start the program in a little less than 1 minute. Just going to give an opportunity for all those folks that are coming into the platform to get registered before we start. That way they won't miss any of the background or the first part of the conversation with Bart Wilson. So bear with me just 1 moment and we'll dive right in for a discussion of the property species. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a book forum with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Bart Wilson, an endowed professor of economics and law at Chapman University. Among other projects, he is the co-founder and director of the Smith Institute for Political Economy and Philosophy, where he collaborates with our friend Vernon Smith on the work of Adam Smith. Some of you might recognize him from a wide array of projects, including his role as a fellow with the Institute for Humane Studies, or an instructor with the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics. His latest book is called The Property Species: Mine, Yours, and the Human Mind. It has a decidedly multidisciplinary approach to explore what it means to be human and the relationship with property. As a result, it's turning heads in economics, linguistics, law, and philosophy. Now, I first met Bart more than 15 years ago. He expertly led groups of regulators through laboratory experiments that provided a new way to understand market design, the cost of information in an exchange, and the role of prices. It's not every day that you find an expert in the constraints of a regulated market and the philosophical implications of Adam Smith. Today, we have both. And as a reminder for everyone, the program is being recorded. We'll make it available at our website, cei.org, as well as on YouTube. Now, as excited as I am to talk about Bart's book, I'd like to get you involved in the conversation. So send your questions to events@cei.org or use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the screen. Let me start by saying, Bart, welcome to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And to get us started, I'd like to read a line from the book. You write, "One of the most consequential and marvelous things about thinking with property is that it makes the routine exchange of things possible, which is the hallmark of humanity and the very foundation of the study of economics." Now, this notion that property is both a hallmark of who we are as a species and the foundation of economics, I'd like to know, is that where you started with the project, or what you came to believe through your research and writing process?
Well, first, thank you for having me on this podcast, this event. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be here, talk about the book. So where did I start? So I had been working on designing some virtual world experiments with Vernon Smith and Sean Crockett, but how exchange would develop and grow and build a market. And we had started then experimenting with property rights, as I would have called it then. And we noticed that we had exogenously enforced that, and we wanted to see, well, what happens if people have to make that work on their own? And what happened was all hell broke loose. Things are flying all over the place, and possession really wasn't stable, except in some very small number of groups. And so I would start talking with my primatologist co-authors about what I was working on in property. And they were very quick to tell me that, oh, well, baboons respect the females in different harems, and dolphins seem to kind of have their own property over their prey. And even birds like scrub jays would rehide their food caches if another scrub jay was watching them while they were hiding it. And so they would tell me, well, property's all over the animal kingdom. And I would also then talk with my colleagues in humanities, and they would tell me that, well, no, property is this modern Western European idea. And so it's very kind of unique to a group of people. And my hunch was neither of them were right. And I had been teaching with Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist, for a good while now. And his thesis there was that humans are the only species to routinely exchange one thing for another thing. So I was kind of primed with that. And that's a very Adam Smithian way of thinking about things. And it also kind of had been lost, I think, in economics. This isn't really where we start thinking about economics, as exchanging of stuff. And so I wanted to explore what property was. There's these two extreme views, and I didn't think either of them was right. And so I wanted to kind of put the question marks deeper down and see where they took me. And they led me to this point where that you can be both kind of culturally different about how we use property and think about property, but there are also some universal aspects that all human groups have about property. And that's where I came to the kind of thesis that opens chapter 1, that property is a universal and uniquely human custom, which will make the biologists not happy, and it's not going to make the people of humanities happy. But I think it's right down the middle and exactly the right way to think about this.
So this hybrid approach, you rely, and you explain quite well, I think, the notion of custom, which is one of those words, I think, where we all think we know what it means, but it has actually this archaic sort of flavor to it. What do you mean by custom? And maybe even we'll get into the discussion of how it differs from your starting point with rights.
So I think an essential feature, if you recognize how property works, is one of the things that we all will recognize is that we have to teach our kids what property is. And they will, as a 2-year-old, claim everything, grab it in their hands and call it mine. And what we have to teach them is that, well, some things are yours and some things are other people's. They're not yours. And so it has to be taught. And I think that's a essential feature of how to understand property, that it has to be taught to every generation. And by custom, though, it's more than that. When I make a claim, or when kids make a claim that something is mine, it's a moral claim. And so custom also can carry with it this notion, one of its definitions of carrying, say, conveying what is right. And so that it's something moral as well. And that is why I wanted to use the word custom, to get that socially transmitted process over time. And then also that it's moral. And that economists tend to not talk about the moral part of it. And also, I don't think we think about it. It has to be taught what it means to be transmitted over time from one generation to another.
And that moral element, the this is right, or the right way of proceeding, it necessarily, to my reading of your work, it necessarily is social. It requires not just me, but me in context of community. Can you
Right.
talk
So
about that, the social nature of this?
yes. So I'm also very much kind of influenced by kind of Peter Stein's work on early Roman law, where the idea was that what is right is out there, and then when we have this conflict, we have to figure out what the rule is deciding. And it was always out there what is right. We just have to figure it out. We have to discover it. And it applies in the past and applies now, and it will also apply going forward. And so that is not just me. So that means if there's a conflict, it's not just my claim that this is mine and that stands. It also kind of depends on all the other people. And this, think about it. If I say this is mine and I want everyone else to accept that, I'm relying on them to use the concept of yours, that they're going to say that is yours to me. And so my claim of mine relies on them thinking about yours. And also then, if we're reciprocal in these relationships of who you are and who I am, then I have to then also respect what is yours. And so mine and thine are intertwined, and you can't have really one without the other. It's got to be us in this thinking about the rules for how to keep us from having conflicting claims of what is mine.
So I do want to get into this really big, I think widely understood set of ideas around rights. But before we do, I see we have our first question from the audience. And it's a philosophical question that you'll recognize in the form of chicken and egg. But Nathaniel asks, what came first, property or exchange?
Well, I think you have to, they come, well, historically, and it is, we can't really pin this thing down really carefully, but it all seems to happen about the same time. So you'll start to see this movement of goods like opals over a long range of distances that have to be hand to hand. They can't be just one person going out traveling hundreds of miles to get this stuff and hauling it back. And at the same time, we see kind of art coming out, painting and things, and you'll start to see complex tools where they put these things together. And all of this is happening around the same time. And so my argument is that once we got abstract thought, that both makes property possible and exchange possible. And so it's when we can think outside the here and now that both of those things start to take off.
And how does the symbolic and abstract thought, how do you pull that through into, can you give us a couple examples about how people think that way today in our everyday life? It's not just these far away, thousands of years ago people.
Well,
what does that mean?
So all animals want things, right? We all want food, we all want sex, we all want housing, we all need shelter and things like that. And for us, we can say, I want that, but we can also say something, this is mine. And they don't mean the same thing. Mine is an abstract concept that stands outside here and now, and it's predicated on something. Because when I make that claim, I'm saying something more than just in this moment. I'm saying, now going forward, that I'm claiming this thing is mine, and that means I have expectations about what's going forward with this. And so I'm outside my thinking right here, right now, and I'm trying to get you to think outside the here and now as well. And that's the key part about property, that it's here to settle disputes and if we can understand the rules when I can say this is mine, then we're going to not bump into each other in the future. And so that's what's different from us and all these other animals, that we can think outside the here and now and talk about it in abstract terms. Now, I think the way the general rule works that you teach kids, you basically teach them don't steal, and you put it in the negative, and that's abstract, right? When does that apply? You have to learn as a kid when that works. When you go in the grocery store, you can't just pick things off the shelf and call it mine as a kid. And so you have to learn what do not steal means. Take lollipop out of the grocery store and to stick it in your pocket. And so that's abstract, and it's beyond what you teach your animals by just reinforcement of kicking them and pushing them around and things like that. No, petting them around. You're talking and thinking abstractly with your kids and with the other people about how this whole relationship between you and things work.
So let me rewind a little bit, because this is an aspect of the work that I was most drawn to, because I feel like I've been reading forever and thinking forever about rights and property rights and the superstructure of law that goes with that to help us understand it, the economic analysis tools that go with us to help us understand it. Both rights and these custom, this notion of custom that you have, they obligate others for enforcement. They both operate, therefore, in a social setting. It's more than the individual. It's not atomistic. They both operate through time. You can have a property rights regime for futures contracts or insurance or other developments of the Enlightenment and Western economic business development. Why is it that you say customs are so different than rights? It's more than a word selection. And I think this is really important for understanding your thesis.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a great setup. So when we teach economics, and that's how I would come to think about these things kind of firsthand, but also when in law and in philosophy, we talk about property through this language of rights. And part of the reason why I kind of delved into this book was I didn't know what really that meant if I started drilling down. What does it mean to have a right to do this? And then I realized that what this means is we're operating at this very macro level of a society. These large groups of people in the modern world, where there are millions upon millions of people all trying to be organized and not bumping into each other. And but and then we talk through property as if that's the reason why we respect things. But that can't be the the actual mechanism. Has to be deeper than that, because kids don't know the government's out there enforcing these things, and yet they're learning these rules. And so I argue that custom is the kind of the individual person in their community embedded notions of how property works, and that kind of works its way up to these bigger society-like structures, and we call those rights, that have to be delineated and written out, or in common law cases, the judge spells out the rule, or the legislature spells out the rule. And that's designed because we got all these communities trying to be united together with a common set of rules. But the moral part of that comes from within the individual and the community they live. And that's where it's all taught, to respect what it is to property. And it's also the kind of experience of dealing with the stuff and things, like, because once you think about property as a custom, you realize that it can evolve over time and it can be different for different groups of people. And so, and that I learned from Bob Ellickson's work on whaling norms. That he
So
really
can you
makes.
tell the story? I think this will be instructive for people to help them get their head around it. The story of the different type of harpoons and lines. We have different rules, and the evolution there, I think, is really going to help illustrate this.
So when whaling is off the coast of the North Atlantic, the Western European whalers would hunt what was called a right whale, and it's the right whale, R-I-G-H-T, because they don't dive when they're harpooned. They swim close to the surface, and they don't have teeth. They're baleen, so they're just like the right one to go after. and so the kind of rule that came out of, and this seems pretty natural, comes out of the playground almost, in a sense, that if the harpoon's in the whale and attached to your boat, no one goes after that whale. So it was called fast fish, loose fish. And but if it happened to get away, you weren't good at what you were doing, or maybe this whale happened to be a little feistier than another one, then it was fair game for somebody else to go after and harpoon. And that worked really well for settling disputes. People weren't going after the same whale and kind of fighting with each other over it. But when whaling moved to the other side of the Atlantic, off the coast of North America, the prey were sperm whales. And sperm whales have teeth. And when they are harpooned, they're going to dive. And that means they're going to take the boat down with you unless you attach a drogue to it to keep it from diving. So the old kind of rule of fast fish, loose fish, harpoon in the whale and attach to your boat really wasn't working well. It had a lot of costs involved with it. And so the American whalers kind of evolved to this new rule called iron holds the whale. Harpoons in the whale, there's a drogue attached to it, and you're in pursuit. And so people have different customs for what they consider to be my whale based upon the ecological conditions. If it's a right whale, it's one kind of rule. If it's a sperm whale, it's another kind of rule. And so people come up with different rules for how to kind of decide what's yours and what's mine based upon the groups that the things are dealing with, the people themselves. They come from a history of culture and traditions. And so we come up and embed this notion of what do not steal means in the context in which we live.
I want to keep with an era, if you will, maybe rewind the clock just a few years, but come back to Adam Smith here. We have a question about it. You talk about the theory of moral sentiments and where property is rooted in resentment. Um, Robert asks about how your thesis is linked to Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, and I think this is an interesting point because so far you've been talking about property as a positive good, right? It's something that can promote exchange and commerce, and it's helps us with other abstract thought about something different than mine. But here we have Adam Smith talking about resentment, and that's worth unpacking a little. Could you talk about that?
So the key for you reading Adam Smith, and basically while the time I was working on this project, I had been reading Adam Smith and working on Adam Smith with Vernon Smith about how to reinterpret experimental economics, the games we do, the
But by
experiments
the
we
way,
run.
I will never get tired of you saying working on Adam Smith with Vernon Smith. It makes me laugh every time. I love it. Vernon being one of the great, brilliant polymaths of this century. So I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
And so kind of my ideas are really steeped in the genius of Adam Smith, and he brings up two main pillars in the theory of moral sentiments: that society is based on beneficence and justice. And beneficence is the domain of people doing good things for other people because they want to do good things, and justice, which is based upon people doing bad things to other people because they want to do bad things too. And so justice part of it is where I can, using his justice theory, to build this notion of how property works. And so he talks about where they each have a moral sentiment to make them work. Beneficence has gratitude, and justice is work based off of resentment. This idea that when somebody does something real and positive harm to me, I feel bad and I want to do something in return to defend myself. And he very eloquently says, resentment is for defense and for defense only. And the idea then is that when I get upset, and this is one cause of property, is if I claim this is mine and somebody tries to take it from me, I feel I'm harmed, then I'm going to fight. I'm going to get angry and I want to defend myself against that. And that can go so far and it can create violence and community problems. But other people in my community might actually, the other part of Smith's theory, empathize with me that I feel the harm from somebody taking something because they don't agree that that's the way things work, that you can just take things from other people. There are rules by that. And so the resentment is something that other people then either agree with me with, or they don't agree with my dispossessor. And that's how kind of property gets off the ground, with this feeling. And I think this is part of what's missing from a lot of discussions of property, that it doesn't get at the feeling involved with how property works. And again, when you 2-year-olds, grab things and then you pull them out of their hand, they get upset quite naturally and quite loudly. And so it's that kind of emotional feeling that prompts us to act. And that in this case, if we're just taking things from each other, we're going to get all riled up and we're going to be creating groups of people might come to my defense, or groups of people might come to my dispossessor's defense, and we're going to have the violence that's going to break down the community. And so we come up with ways then to settling those disputes. And so Adam Smith is key to this, to understanding what gets this off the ground, that we're going to get all hot and heavy about things being taken from each other, and that we got to find ways to bring down that heat, and that ultimately property is about creating peace, that so that we have these rules out there, we have expectations about when you can claim things as mine and when you can't, and then we kind of avoid all of that conflict. And resentment is the key that we're trying to kind of put down. Smith, I'll just quickly wrap this up. Smith has a nice line from the Lectures in Jurisprudence where he says the end of justice is to secure from injury. And that's what property is about. The end of property is to secure us from imposing real and positive hurt on other people. Because people naturally are out there who want to take things from other people. There's got bad impulses as human beings. And that's kind of what we're trying to settle.
That now that all flows very naturally. This discussion of sentiments and justice and resentment, and your argument for property as a condition to drive us to its end, to peace. I'm attracted to. Like I said, it flows naturally. Why does property have such a bad name? I mean, the popular opinion would be something about property and acquisitiveness and the search for more stuff, and this is the base of our conflicts. And in fact, your colleagues, the economists, it's one of the core assumptions about making economic models is that at a given price in certain conditions, set conditions, people will want more, not less, of a good. I mean, that's how we understand what an economic good is. So why is it that property has such a bad name if its ultimate end is peace?
So part of that comes from the notion that property didn't always mean the thing. We didn't like this pen is my property. That's a very modern way of talking. And it comes in sometime in the late 19th century, and people really don't know when. I think it'd be fun maybe to figure that out. But property always meant from Roman times, and even in English Anglo jurisprudence, meant the kind of the custom and right behind the thing. It's never the thing itself. And so I think what we need to separate is that property, when people talk about property creating conflict, it's about the thing, and they're blaming that and the idea of claiming it as mine. And yes, we're acquisitive of species. We want to acquire more stuff. And I think another feature of us being symbolic is we always want more because we can think outside the here and now. We can't be satiated in some sense. But it's not about the claiming of it of mine that is the problem. It's about claiming of the mind and not having respect for that as yours. And
so it's the second half of the equation. It's yes. Not the this is mine. It's and that other thing is your thing.
Right. So that's part what gets missing. And so when people are kind of have qualms about what property is causing this, it's because we're not thinking about the that is yours part of it. We're only thinking about people going out there claiming more, and that somehow it's this custom that makes us do that. And I want to reject that the idea that it's the custom of property itself that makes us want more stuff. I think that comes, again, if you think about property as being about an ethical character, then it's about me being responsible for when I make claims of things and not just trying to masquerade, I want this with a claim of this is mine. Because that's, I think so there's this conflation between kind of the custom, what property means, the thing itself, and then getting kind of concerned that while people always want more stuff, it's because they want stuff that's a problem. It's because we don't have a rule, and we're also, human beings, we're flawed. We're gonna be times in which case we're gonna want to break those rules, and that will create problems. And so it's not the custom that's the problem, and it's the it's the character that we bring to this custom. And I'll just kind of add one thing to that, which means that we can get bad customs involving property. that it does, just because it's a custom doesn't make it good. And property isn't absolutely good. And that's
but it would seem that it has an important characteristic. It has the potential to be self-correcting.
It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And this is where I think people talk about notions of power, that if the custom kind of gets settled with people kind of imposing it on others, and that could be the problem. And so that might need to be corrected. and Hayek talks about that sometimes these kind of social customs evolve, but they might need some legislative correction at some point because they go down. Because if it's the landlords who kind of have influencing over the law might be influencing landlords to exclusion of to the renters and things like that.
I have a couple of questions here about influences, and you mentioned Hayek, and that's part of our second question here. But from Sterling, have you been influenced by Michael Taylor's work on custom and governance in tribal societies? Here he's talking about custom and shaming and ostracization, things of that nature.
I am not familiar with his work. I should be on my list of things to read. But yeah, I have read a lot about how custom works in small groups and in tribal societies, and that was important to how I think about this. That because part of my other part of this project, this is all, it's a uniquely human custom, is that it's for all humans. It's somehow this way of thinking about property. I wanted to put together a thesis that uncovered all groups, not just modern Western Europeans. And so that by thinking about property as a custom, we can then think about it. There's some same abstract forms that we see in hunter-gatherer societies, and we'll see in these most Western European, we would call it capitalist commercial societies, and that there's some common themes there that come out of it. And I wanted to make sure that I could handle the tribal part of it as well, that the Australian or Aborigines would also have kind of fit this theory in a way that would be consistent with commercial society.
Okay, I have another question. In just a moment, I want to turn to experimental economics. So that's my heads up for you. But before we get there, more about these intellectual influences, I have a question from Steve. And I'm going to read the whole thing. Steve's a fan favorite here. Most recent winner of our Julian Simon Award, Professor Horwitz,
Okay.
Asks, I love this idea of the institution of property as an evolved custom that has to be taught. Funny, coming from a professor. How does that relate to Hayek's distinction between what we might call the collectivism of our long evolutionary past and the modern world of markets? Is Hayek wrong in his reading of the evolutionary record? Is it a particular challenge to teach kids to respect the property of anonymous others in the face of an evolutionary disposition to think first and foremost of our kin? So there's a lot there, but there's something central about transmitting these ideas and forming social custom.
So I think the tension that Hayek is getting at is, and he has a phrase in the Fatal Conceit. I wish I could pull it together quickly, about how rules unite the extended order. Rules alone unite the extended order. And I think that's where the tension he's getting at, that once you have these different communities that are wanting to be extended, kind of be tied together in trade, you need to come up with a rule that makes that work. And sometimes that means then you're going to have to pick a rule that's not going to make a community happy. And so that's where, in order to kind of, you could have your own local rules about how property works, but if you're going to make extended, the actual rules that come about that are going to put those groups together might be in conflict with that. And that's where we're going to have this my group versus your group kind of tension that I think Hayek is getting at. So it's taught, but as the communities start to build upon each other, that's when we're getting, I would argue, that's where we're getting the language of rights. That's where we're trying to set up rules, and that when we settle a conflict, we have to pick a rule. Something has to be done that it might then rub against the local community. And so there's a tension that can't be, tension that's not just going to go away just because a judge declares a rule or a legislature sets the rule.
I'm not sure everyone is familiar with, but this is a good opportunity to share, and then we can get into how it influenced your work here. Could you just give us the short kind of elevator pitch what is this idea, this field of experimental economics? How does that work? When I say you were in the laboratory, what am I telling people?
So I build virtual worlds of questions about economics that I'm interested in studying. I think I have an idea about how it works. And so I'm going to create these virtual worlds, computerized markets, or in these cases of property experiments, kind of virtual worlds of people producing and consuming and moving around in the world together. And I want to test my theories about how I think things work. And so it's a method of inquiry where I develop different conditions and then I randomize assignment to them, and I want to see, well, is this the explanation I think at work? And that's, so causation comes from, I got this random assignment to people to treatment conditions, and I am holding everything else constant. What happens when these people interact with each other? And so, and what we do is we recruit undergraduates in non-pandemic times into our laboratory, and we pay them for the decisions they make. And so experiments that kind of got me interested in property, we gave them a field where they could produce stuff, in a house where they would consume it, and then in a chat room where they can talk about things. And then we just said, items that have been moved to your house are going to generate earnings a particular way for consuming them. It was in the passive voice. We didn't tell them how, because they could learn and discover on their own that they can move stuff from their field to their house, but they could also move it to somebody else's field or house. And in the property experiments, they can learn, they can move them from somebody else's field into my house. And so they can discover that all on their own, and then we're leaving it up to them to see how things shake out. And the treatment conditions are, well, how can we, what makes this work or not work? And so we see groups where things are flying over the place, but there's really just seems to be like one bad actor out there. And so we create a treatment condition where we allow people to shun that person. Like, all right, let's put them away. You can protect yourself from them, and maybe the world will be a better place. The problem was that didn't work. We were wrong, because once you give people that power, they'll just isolate themselves. Like, all right, and now we have no specialization, because I'm all out there worried about people taking stuff. So let me isolate myself and I'll shun them, and everyone shuns each other. And now we're all poor because we're not trading. No one's taking anything, but we're not trading either. And so we thought this would work. We put the test up there. The experiment, the subjects told us, well, that wasn't the right notion. You're on the right track. And in that particular project, we tried 3 or 4 different things, and none of them worked. Like, the idea that we as the experimenter were designing this and kind of like, we're going to set this group of people on the right path to prosperity, we couldn't do that. We can't do that externally. And what it taught us was that it has to come from within the group. And that's the other part of experimental economics. It's the idea of testing your own presuppositions about how the world works, and then realizing when the subjects tell you that's not how it's working, what am I thinking? How am I thinking about this the wrong way? How can I change that? And that's the kind of the beautiful thing about kind of experimental economics, and in my case, learning it from Vernon Smith, that this idea of being disabused is, I think, the word he uses, by your subjects on what you think you know, and then being forced to think about the world in a different way.
And understand the world.
Yes, and understand it. And it's understand it in a new way, yes. So it opens up like, oh, this is, every experiment I have run, I have been surprised about something. And that's led me to be a lot more humble about what I think about how the world works, that I'm going to be wrong about something and surprised about either it's I'm pessimistic about what people can achieve, or I'm overly optimistic about what I think people can achieve. And I then have to kind of reframe the problem and put it back to the test. Then I design a new treatment, and see what I've learned.
Last question, at least for now, on this idea about influences from Patrick. He asks about Mises. And he says, Ludwig Mises is very big on the concept of property rights and free markets needing peace in order to work to the benefit of society. Has Mises influenced your research?
So I've just gotten into reading Mises. I had read bits and pieces of Mises here and there, mainly for different Liberty Fund colloquia. But I hadn't really kind of read him, like, well, Human Action from beginning to end. And so he hasn't been a direct influence on me. But as I'm reading him, he's very much thinking about the world from a kind of macro perspective and kind of the and and so I'm interested in, I want to start from the other end, kind of from the ground up, from the individual and their communities, and these communities then becoming united as we kind of build these kind of super polities. And so I'm interested to see where that goes. So I'm just kind of getting into understanding kind of Mises's arguments.
I want to change gears for a moment here and talk, move you in the direction of ethics, which is not something that we often find in a discussion of economics or regulatory economics, um, but it's clearly important. You know, you cannot. I don't think you can get through the day. You certainly can't pick up a newspaper today without some commentary somewhere in your life about how bad things are right now between people, and polarization and strife and whatnot. Let me share a line for the audience from the book and ask you to explain it and expound upon it. You say, moreover, we have to be open to the possibility that commerce may be an integral part of that socializing and ethicizing process. Now, what do you mean about that? The commerce and enterprise and exchange, how does that drive us toward being better toward each other?
So you have to think about other people if you're in business and if you're going to be in commerce. And I think the part that gets missed, I mean, when I'm talking to my first year students in their first year seminars, that commerce is as hard, and I'm going to take this from Deirdre McCloskey, is about persuading other people to do something. And that means thinking about how I can do something for you. And that's not how not kind of the general way people think about commerce. It's all about taking. And I think at its core, you know, if you talk to small business owners in particular about what they're doing, they're trying to find a way. How can I persuade people to come in through my door? They're thinking about others, and that makes them think about others. You know, and that's a good thing if we're thinking about other people. And I think there's a tendency to want to say commerce is all about greed. And I'm not saying there aren't greedy people out there. In fact, there are greedy people out there. But I'm saying there are a lot of non-greedy people out there as well that are thinking about other people through this exchange of goods and services. And this is a great thing that kind of binds us together. And I'm arguing that property is one of these things that does bind us together, that if we are thinking about it of mine and thine, of where that line is, and that there should be, if that is yours is just as important as this is mine, that we are thinking about other people and that we're respecting those other people, those when we say that is yours. And that's a good thing, the more we think about us being united in that idea.
You've mentioned uh, Matt Ridley, Vernon Smith, um, and now you just mentioned Deirdre McCloskey's work. As a side note, I'll mention for our audience, all three of whom are winners of the Julian Simon Award here at CEI. We had Steve Horwitz, so there's a fourth. Where does Deirdre's work fit in for you? I mean, there's a pretty good discussion of it, and I think there's something of a not a direct conflict, but a challenge as you work through these notions. Tell us about how her work about the development of kind of bourgeois ethics, where that all fits in.
So her thesis is that it was an appreciation, a change of ideas about how you approach commerce and how you think about commerce that makes the dynamic change starting in the 18th century take off in England and then spread around the world. And I've watched many economists resist this. They'll push back. She writes a whole second volume saying how all of their theories, that one doesn't work, that one doesn't work, Cole doesn't answer, none of these answers. It's got to be ideas that will explain this huge increase, this 10 to 100-fold increase around the world of how our living standards. So for her, it's an idea. It's about ideology, not materialism, that can explain what happened in the last 250 to 300 years. That idea that it's about our mind and that it's in there is at the core of how I started approaching property, when I realized that was what my conflict was with biologists, that it is in how we perceive this thing, that I have this abstract thought and you have this abstract thought that allows us to do marvelous things, and it can then explain why no other animal does this. So if I say, this is not mine, this is yours, the physical world is exactly the same, but how we perceive this thing has changed. The way we interact with each other is completely changed. I cannot do same things with this that I used to be able to do. My expectations have changed, your expectations have changed, but the physical world hasn't in all changed. And that makes possible us to exchange stuff. Then you can say the same thing to me about something. This is not mine, this is yours. And it has to go up here. And this can explain then why we're the only trading animal that is out there. And it's an idea. It's about how the mind works that makes this possible.
And so can we have property in an idea?
Well, so that's why, so that's the fantastic thing about abstract thought, right? And as Matt really says, ideas can have sex. You can apply abstract thought all over the place. It's exciting. That's why we have art. We have these great ideas, a fusion of ideas. And so we've applied it to tools. We then apply it to land, and we're like, now in the modern Western world, we're applying it to these ideas. But here's the problem. I argue that all human societies have this, and we have this kind of architecture of the brain that then makes our minds think about property the same way, that we put it inside the thing. And the nice thing about things is they have a border, the inside and outside and a border, and it's all nice and contained. And that works well for spears, and it works well for pens and cups and things like that. But it works well for cows, things like you go through human history. But an idea doesn't have an inside and an outside and a boundary in the same physical way. And it's bound then to create these tensions and conflicts of, no, that's my idea. No, that's your idea. Where is that boundary? And that's the whole game of the patent office, is how do you draw those lines and make them, and they're prone to conflicts because there aren't clear boundaries. And so we can do it, but I'm saying there's going to be, the reason why we have that mess is that it's kind of built on a notion that is built from a physical world, and we're trying to deal with the intangible world.
So the Econ 101 that so many of us remember, the ideas about excludability, divisibility, things that go toward ownership and goods and necessarily property. Does that model, that economist model of the world, is it flawed, or is it it's not quite right definitionally maybe, but it's good enough to help us sort through these problems? Because it seems that you're saying some property, I mean, if you can't clearly define the inside outside boundaries, then it's not property, it's something else.
Well, it just means that it's going to be messier. Like, this can be much clearer, and we can draw the lines, and even there, humans can come up with certain situations where we had good faith expectations. We have no idea what the right rule is. But I'm just saying with ideas, it's just going to be messier. And if there's something I want people to take away from the book, it's that you have to think about how people on the ground think about it, how their minds work, and then the communities they're built in. And if you're going to kind of do this, create property in ideas, um, top down part, not taking in consideration how people on the ground are thinking about it, is going to lead to more conflicts. And so and I think that's part of my project, is to, if we can understand how this process builds up, we can have a better integration from the top to the bottom and the bottom up to the top. And I don't really see that happening in IP. I think I see it very much coming top down. It certainly was at the beginning, when music became digital, and the young kids, I guess that was almost me, but you know, they had no respect for those boundaries, but all the artists were all kind of upset, like Metallica was one of those. They break, protect their IP, but it didn't fit with how people's notions on the ground were thinking about it. And what had to happen was we had to evolve and create this technology called streaming. In which case now people who are taking music, and well, it's pretty easy. I can just click a button and I get charged for it at a monthly fee, and we kind of worked our way out of it. But the initial response was very much this top down. I want to impose this boundary on this, and it was in conflict with how people on the ground thought about it. And there needed to be a way to kind of everyone to think and be more flexible about how we're going to come up with a solution to this, such that we still get artists getting paid and we get more art, and people, how they think about how the rules of property work, kind of jive with their own minds.
But before we start to wrap up, and I do want to ask you to explain for everyone what you're looking forward to, what you're working on, what's coming down the pipe for you. I do want to try to squeeze in one more kind of big idea, because I think it's foundational for how so many people interested in public policy, especially in the West and in America, how we think about the relationships of law and property. Um, can you just speak for a moment or two about your discussion and what you learned and what we ought to take away from John Locke's interpretation of property, the profound influence he's had? Um, Many folks, I'm sure, are familiar with those great words in the Declaration of Independence. There we're talking about rights, and at the last moment in the last draft, a right to property got scratched out. So where does Locke fit into all of this? Because we tend to lean on him hard for our contemporary conversations about property.
So his starting point is that there are these natural rights, and if we can delineate those things and we can build out of that, you can see then how property would come from that. And I think what he's missing is that where they come from is that they come out of our everyday experiences and interacting with our community as well. We might call that kind of a natural right, but in the end, it's, if you want to and this is the value of looking at biology, all these other species kind of come up with their own little practices as well, and they're all about kind of trying to avoid conflict as well, that we're going to be doing the same thing when we're dealing people and things. And so, but I think the thing he got right, and then he gets kind of poked fun of by modern philosophers, and was this notion of kind of mixing your labor with a thing. And that this is seemed, so if you work on something and you create it, then you've mixed your labor with it, therefore it's yours. And that is intuitive. And if the people understand one thing about Locke and property, it's that. And I think my book explains why that makes sense and why it is so popular, people intuitive.
And it's so embedded in our common law tradition. This is where all the cases come from.
Yes. And it's in our intuitions about how we would settle these disputes. And so that we literally put ourselves into things. And by that, I mean, we think about ourselves being in this thing. So that it's a part of us, just like tools are a part of us. And so when you create something, You create a spear, and you use it, it's part of you. And that's what Locke was tapping into with his labor mixing theory. And I think that's right. And then the cool thing is with humans, we can set that thing down and we're still in it. And now that I expect other people to expect that I'm in this thing.
Would it work better if we allowed for a little fuzziness of the definition around natural in his natural rights theory to mean both naturally occurring emergent systems, emergent knowledge, as well as natural in the form of endowed by nature and nature's God?
Well, both of those are customary ways of thinking about the world. That's what so you don't have a right if you don't have the idea and the common thinking behind it. That's my point. That when we say we have a right to, we are making some claim to a customary way of thinking about this. And that maybe we bring that up because we're kind of disputing this and we're not quite clear what that boundary is. But there really isn't a right to anything if we don't have the ideas behind it and the customary of thinking way behind it in order to make that work. And so, yes, I think that what you're talking about then is a way to kind of blend that. And the modern discourse on rights it's like a thing. And if I pull out a right and you pull out a right, well, now we have to decide which one it is. And if we think about, well, this right has an idea and a thinking behind it, and this one has an idea of thinking, how can we now work to put these things together to come up with a way that kind of works, makes them both work?
Let me ask you, uh, what's the most important thing you want for a lay audience to take away from this work? And is that different? And if so, how? What do you want lawmakers who come up with the rules for how we adjudicate these things? What do you want them to take away from the book?
So for people in general, I think we've lost the idea that the property is about peace. It's all about creating conflict. And given human nature, it's good. We're good at creating it, and we're good at coming up with ways of mitigating it. That I want us to think that maybe there are ways by which property creates peace, and that this is a universally human thing. That every human group are trying to find ways to mitigate conflict and to kind of bring peace to the group, and that property is one way that we're doing that. For lawmakers, uh, I would like them to think about it, how it comes, what are the minds of the people that you're passing these laws for? How are they thinking about this? How do different local communities think about this? As opposed to kind of, I'm going to think through my head how this is going to work, and then I'm going to impose it on people. That we need to have a dialogue between those articulated rules at the national and state level and the communities that are going to actually have to live with them. And maybe there's some insights coming from how these local groups are solving the problem. And I'll throw in one more person. That was Eleanor Ostrom's insights. That
Yes,
she
yes.
goes straight to the groups of people and thinking about it. And they might have ideas about how this works, and we should take those to heart.
There's wonderful echoes through your examples to Eleanor's work with problem solving, real life problem solving for who gets access to a resource and can claim that resource. So I commend you for that. Um, let me ask you real quickly to explain what is it that you're working on that you're most excited about, and you want people to check back in on Bart Wilson down the road here.
So my last book was with Vernon Smith. I'll just pitch it right here. Uh,
Humanomics,
him,
everyone.
yes. That was integrating Adam Smith into how we interpret and understand economics. And the big word that come out, way of understanding things that was new for me was that he talks about the world in terms of conduct, not behavior. And conduct, unlike behavior, brings in these as moral elements. It's how you conduct yourself. Only humans conduct themselves. A dog doesn't conduct itself, it behaves or doesn't behave. And so conduct is important. And I want to kind of build up economics through human conduct. So an idea, one reason why I started reading Mises is I want to take the ideas of human action, but call it human conduct, and then get understanding principles, which means we're going to have that moral part right from the beginning. Mine and thine is right there at the beginning of how you think of economics and conduct with people. And then for me is, how do I get from custom to a rights? How does that whole process work? And I think I want to use a kind of an evolutionary model of explaining how, like with natural selection, means become um, causes, and causes become means again, and that is one way of thinking about conduct. You'll get this process of being transmitted over time, and you'll kind of get to see how it reinforces. And I'll have to work in McCloskey's work about how that then makes the 18th century special and different.
I love the idea that I'm going to superimpose on you. I believe you were saying, I love the idea that notion of conduct and through time, it allows for learning and adaptation, which is a central feature of markets and that discovery process that we're always emphasizing here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Bart, this is a wonderful achievement. It is challenging. It's going to challenge people to consider what they think they know. You've drawn together information from a variety of fields in a compelling way. Thank you for being with us. I want to remind our audience, the book's available, so you should buy it. It's called The Property Species. And then we'll be back here with Policy Forum on February 24th. The next one is from CEI. It's called The Next Chapter in U.S. Antitrust Law, True Crime, Tragedy, or Comedy. I'll note that it comes with a question mark at the end. We have a great panel lined up. All the information about it, as well as registration, is available on our website at cei.org. We have a March book forum scheduled with Greenpeace co-founder Patrick Moore and recent Julian Simon Award winner Johan Norberg to talk about their recent books. And very soon, you'll see details about the 2021 CEI agenda for Congress. All those things are coming your way. If you have questions, do not hesitate to drop me a line. And as I always do, I want to ask and remind everyone that we'd love 60 seconds of your time. We do want that customer feedback, and there'll be a survey coming to you automatically as we log out of the program today. Bart, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.